Edward III, the warrior king who built England's medieval power. Welcome to Bio Bytes, the channel where we dive deep into the lives of history's most fascinating figures. Today, we're uncovering the story of a king who changed the course of England's destiny, Edward III, a ruler often overshadowed in history books. Yet his reign marked the rise of England as a medieval powerhouse. From his dramatic rise to power, his revolutionary military strategies, to his enduring legacy as a warrior king, we're about to explore the life of Edward III in vivid detail. So sit back, relax, and join us on this journey through the highs, lows, and monumental achievements of one of England's most pivotal monarchs. Edward III was born on a chilly November day in 1312 at Windsor Castle, nestled in the heart of Berkshire. His arrival was a cause for immense celebration, not just because he was the son of Edward II, King of England, but because he secured the future of the English throne. At the time, his father's reign was already fraught with controversy and instability. Edward II, though the son of the formidable Edward Longshanks, remembered as one of England's most powerful medieval kings, struggled to fill his father's towering shadow. His rule was plagued by political unrest, a reliance on unpopular advisors, and bitter conflicts with the English nobility. It was against this backdrop of turbulence that the young Edward was born. From the moment of his birth, the weight of expectation rested heavily on his small shoulders. Yet, no one could have imagined that this child, born into a kingdom on the brink of chaos, would grow up to lead England into its golden age of medieval dominance. Edward III's journey from boy prince to warrior king was about to begin, and it was nothing short of extraordinary. When Edward III was born, England was a kingdom in turmoil. His father, Edward II, had inherited the throne just a few years earlier, but his reign was already proving to be a disaster. The once great legacy of Edward I, known as Edward Longshanks, was crumbling under the weight of weak leadership and mounting resentment. Edward I had been a king of unparalleled strength and ambition, a ruler who reshaped England and expanded its borders. During his reign, he conquered Wales, fought fiercely in Scotland, and extended English influence across Ireland. He created a centralized government, strengthened the justice system, and left England as one of the most powerful states in medieval Europe. But for all his success, Edward II left a dangerous legacy. His aggressive campaigns and reforms had relied on an iron fist and unwavering authority. Without someone equally strong to wield that power, it could all unravel. And it did. Edward II, the new king, was a stark contrast to his father. Where Edward I had been commanding, Edward II was indecisive. Where his predecessor inspired respect and fear, the younger Edward drew only disdain. The greatest issue, however, wasn't just his lack of leadership, but his choices in who to trust. He surrounded himself with favorites, granting them lands, titles, and influence far beyond what was acceptable to England's powerful nobility. One such figure was Piers Gaveston, a young nobleman who had gained Edward's favor long before he ascended the throne. Their relationship was a source of endless speculation, with some wondering if it went beyond mere friendship. Whatever the truth, Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston infuriated England's lords. He showered Gaveston with power, even making him the Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for members of the royal family. The nobility saw this as a betrayal, an insult that could not be ignored. Tensions reached a boiling point, and in 1312, the very year Edward III was born, Piers Gaveston was captured and executed by a group of powerful nobles. This act of defiance against the king set the tone for Edward II's reign. His rule became a constant tug-of-war between a weak king, his ambitious favorites, and a nobility unwilling to be sidelined. Adding to the kingdom's instability were external threats and failures. Edward II lost the ground his father had gained in Scotland, suffering a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Meanwhile, a devastating famine swept through England, leaving the population desperate and disillusioned. This was the England young Edward III was born into, a kingdom divided, a monarchy under siege, and a legacy of power slipping through the cracks. Yet from this chaos, Edward III would rise. His future was not just to repair his father's failures, but to restore the glory of his grandfather's reign, and in many ways, surpass it. Edward III's childhood was shaped by the turbulence of his father's reign, but also by the need to prepare him for the enormous responsibility that lay ahead. From an early age, Edward was placed in a separate household, one that operated independently of his parents, King Edward II and Queen Isabella. This was a common practice for royal heirs, meant to instill discipline, focus, and the skills necessary for governance and leadership. Despite the upheaval surrounding his father's rule, Edward's upbringing offered him a structured environment, one designed to groom him for the throne. His tutors emphasized physical training over scholarly pursuits, reflecting the values of the High Middle Ages, where a king's ability to lead in battle often defined his success. Edward learned to ride expertly, handle weapons, and excel in the art of war. These were skills that would serve him well in the years to come. His education wasn't entirely devoid of academics, though. He was taught to read and write in English and French, the dominant languages of the court and diplomacy, and acquired some knowledge of Latin, though his proficiency in the language remained basic. There is also evidence to suggest that he may have learned Flemish or German, given his family's connections to continental Europe. However, books and languages were secondary to the training that would make him a warrior king. Edward wasn't alone in his household. Over time, he was joined by siblings, including his younger brother, John of Eltham, born in 1316, and two sisters, Eleanor and Joan, born in 1318 and 1321. While his family grew, so too did the political tension surrounding them. His father's reliance on unpopular advisors and the rising power of Hugh Despencer, another royal favorite, created deep divisions within the court and the nobility. These political struggles inevitably affected Edward's early life. By the time he was nearing his 10th year, England was spiraling into civil war. Powerful nobles rebelled against his father's favoritism toward the Despencer family, and the country was rife with unrest. Though Edward was likely shielded from much of the chaos, the tension around him must have been palpable. Curiously, unlike many heirs to the English throne before and after him, Edward was never granted the title of Prince of Wales. Instead, he was styled as the Earl of Chester throughout his youth. While this decision remains unexplained, it is another unusual aspect of Edward's early years, one that set him apart from his predecessors. During his formative years, Edward's focus remained on physical training and preparation for leadership. He learned what it meant to command respect and loyalty, skills he would need to assert himself in the turbulent years that followed. Despite the instability of his father's reign, Edward's upbringing provided him with the tools he would later use to transform himself into one of England's most iconic kings. As Edward III grew into a young boy, the cracks in his father's rule deepened into chasms. The king's reliance on the Despencer family had alienated nearly every corner of the kingdom, and resentment was brewing among the nobility. But the most dangerous opposition came from within the royal family itself. Queen Isabella, Edward's mother. Isabella had been married to Edward II since her teenage years. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France, and her marriage to Edward was meant to solidify ties between the two kingdoms. However, the union was anything but harmonious. Isabella grew increasingly estranged from her husband, particularly as she watched him favor Hugh Despencer above all others, leaving her sidelined and humiliated at court. By the mid-1320s, Isabella's discontent turned into outright rebellion. She found an ally in Roger Mortimer, a powerful nobleman who had fled England after opposing Edward II. Mortimer and Isabella became close, so close that whispers of an affair began to circulate. Together, they began plotting to overthrow Edward II and dismantle the power of the Despensers. Their plan gained momentum in 1325, when a conflict between England and France created an opening. As tensions flared over English territories in France, Isabella persuaded Edward II to send her to Paris as a diplomatic emissary. The king, perhaps eager to ease tensions with his estranged wife, agreed, but he had no idea what she had planned. Once in Paris, Isabella refused to return to England. She claimed she would not return while Hugh Despencer remained in power, framing herself as a defender of justice and the crown prince. Her young son, Edward, the boy, just 12 years old at the time, was sent to join her in France, ostensibly to represent the English crown during negotiations. But this was a pivotal move in Isabella's rebellion. With the future king now under her control, Isabella's position was immeasurably strengthened. In the French court, she and Mortimer gathered a coalition of exiled English nobles and mercenaries, building an army to challenge Edward II's rule. Their cause was presented as a quest to protect young Edward, the rightful heir, from the corrupting influence of the Despensers. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer made their move. They struck a deal with the Count of Hainault, securing military support in exchange for a future marriage alliance between young Edward and the Count's daughter, Philippa. With a small force of around 700 soldiers, they landed in England, sparking a rebellion that would bring down Edward II. Young Edward's role in this plan was crucial. As the figurehead of their movement, his very presence legitimized the rebellion. The sight of the future king marching at their side rallied support from disillusioned nobles and ordinary citizens alike. Within weeks, Edward II's position collapsed. The king was captured, the Despensers were executed, and Isabella and Mortimer seized control of the government. At just 14 years old, Edward III was crowned king in January 1327. But it was clear to all that the real power lay with Isabella and Mortimer. For now, young Edward remained a pawn in their game. Yet, this dramatic turn of events planted the seeds for the extraordinary ruler he would later become. Watching his mother and Mortimer manipulate the kingdom taught him valuable lessons about power, betrayal, and the importance of asserting control, lessons he would never forget. The overthrow of Edward II marked one of the most dramatic and decisive moments in English history. When Isabella and Mortimer landed in Suffolk in late 1326, their army was small, but their cause quickly gained momentum. Years of dissatisfaction with Edward II's rule and the unchecked power of the Despencer family had created deep resentment across the kingdom. Now, many saw Isabella and her young son Edward as a beacon of hope. As they advanced through England, support for the rebellion grew at an astonishing rate. Cities and towns opened their gates, and even members of the nobility, who had once hesitated to defy the king, joined the cause. The capital, London, declared for Isabella and her son, sealing Edward II's fate. The king fled westward in a desperate bid to rally loyal supporters, but it was too late. By November, he was captured in South Wales and imprisoned at Kenilworth Castle. Hugh Despencer, his closest ally, was caught soon after and met a grisly end, executed in a manner designed to underline the nobility's anger. The Despencer family's reign of influence was over, and with it, Edward II's power crumbled. In January 1327, Isabella and Mortimer summoned Parliament to decide the king's fate. For the first time in English history, the nobility and clergy formally deposed a reigning monarch. Edward II, broken and isolated, reluctantly agreed to abdicate. The crown was passed to his son, the 14-year-old Edward III, who was proclaimed king on January 25, 1327. A week later, he was crowned in a ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Yet Edward III's accession to the throne did not mark the beginning of his reign in any meaningful sense. At 14, he was still a boy, and the reins of power remained firmly in the hands of Isabella and Mortimer. The new king was little more than a figurehead, his role limited to lending legitimacy to their rule. Parliament had agreed that Edward would govern with the guidance of a council of bishops, earls, and barons. But Isabella and Mortimer quickly sidelined this arrangement. They ruled England as de facto monarchs, consolidating power and rewarding their allies. However, their hold on power was far from secure. Edward II, though deposed, was still alive, and his mere existence posed a threat. Rumors began to swirl that factions of discontented nobles might attempt to free him and restore him to the throne. Isabella and Mortimer acted swiftly. In September 1327, Edward II was discreetly murdered at Berkeley Castle, likely on their orders. This act, while effective in removing a rival, cast a long shadow over their rule, adding to the growing resentment against them. For Edward III, these events were formative. Though outwardly compliant, he must have observed the tension and political maneuvering around him. The experience of being a king in name only, watching others wield the power that was rightfully his, would leave a lasting impression. The young monarch was biding his time, learning the lessons of courtly intrigue and waiting for the moment to assert his authority. The overthrow of Edward II was a turning point for England. It marked the end of a weak and divisive reign, paving the way for the rise of Edward III. Yet, it also set the stage for a new chapter of political drama, one in which the young king would soon step forward to claim his destiny. The early years of Edward III's reign were defined by a delicate balance of power. On paper, he was the king, but in reality, the kingdom was controlled by his mother, Isabella, and her close ally, Roger Mortimer. Together they ruled with an iron grip, consolidating their power through patronage and harsh measures against dissent. However, their regency was marked by growing discontent, and tensions began to mount as their rule became increasingly authoritarian. Mortimer, once an exile and rebel, now wielded extraordinary influence. He styled himself as the Earl of March and surrounded himself with loyal supporters, effectively creating a shadow monarchy. Isabella, too, enjoyed the privileges of power, spending lavishly and holding court as though she were the true ruler of England. For a time, they maintained their authority, but their excesses and heavy-handed tactics sowed the seeds of their downfall. Edward, though young, was no fool. He watched as Mortimer alienated the nobility with his arrogance and as his mother's reputation deteriorated under the weight of public and political scrutiny. The murder of his father, Edward II, had not been forgotten, and whispers of Mortimer's involvement in the act circulated throughout the kingdom. Resentment toward the regents grew, and even some of their initial supporters began to question their loyalty. By 1330, Edward was nearing his 18th birthday. He had grown increasingly frustrated with being a puppet king, sidelined from the decisions that shaped his realm. More importantly, he recognized the danger Mortimer posed, not just to the crown, but to his own position as king. Mortimer's ambition was boundless, and rumors began to spread that he and Isabella intended to usurp the throne entirely. Some even speculated that Mortimer would divorce his wife and marry Isabella, further cementing their rule. Encouraged by a group of trusted advisors, including his close ally William Montague, Edward began planning a bold move to reclaim his authority. The opportunity came in October 1330, when Mortimer and Isabella were holding court at Nottingham Castle. Edward's allies discovered a secret passageway leading into the castle, and on the night of October 19th, Edward and a small band of loyal men infiltrated the stronghold. What followed was a swift and decisive coup. Mortimer's supporters were caught off guard, and a scuffle ensued. Several of Mortimer's attendants were killed, but the regent himself was captured alive. Isabella, too, was taken into custody, her protests ignored by the young king. By morning, Edward had declared his intent to rule in his own name, marking the end of Isabella and Mortimer's regency. Mortimer was swiftly transported to London, where he was accused of treason and high crimes. His trial was more of a formality than a genuine legal proceeding, and by November 29th, he was executed at Tyburn. His death sent a clear message to the kingdom. Edward III was now firmly in control. As for Isabella, her fate was more merciful. Though her role in Mortimer's schemes could not be denied, Edward spared his mother from execution. Instead, she was placed under house arrest at Windsor Castle and later allowed to retire to Castle Rising in Norfolk. There she lived out her days in relative comfort, a fallen queen who had once ruled in her son's name. The coup at Nottingham Castle was a defining moment in Edward's early reign. It marked his transition from a passive figurehead to a true king, determined to shape his kingdom according to his own vision. More importantly, it demonstrated his ability to act decisively and strategically, a trait that would come to define his rule. The shadow of Mortimer's regency had been lifted, and Edward III was ready to forge his own legacy. As Edward III asserted his authority over England, his attention soon turned to Scotland, where the Second War of Scottish Independence was raging. The conflict had been simmering since the death of Edward I, who had left a legacy of English dominance over Scotland. Under Edward II's rule, however, that grip had loosened. The disastrous defeat at Bannockburn in 1314 had emboldened the Scots, and their independence seemed increasingly secure under Robert the Bruce. But Edward III was determined to reclaim what his father had lost and restore England's influence over its northern neighbor. The situation in Scotland was complicated. After Robert the Bruce's death in 1329, the Scottish throne passed to his young son, David II. The new king's minority created an opening for Edward Balliol, a claimant to the Scottish throne who had been living in exile. Known as one of the disinherited, Balliol had been stripped of his lands in Scotland during Bruce's campaigns. Now, with the support of discontented Scottish nobles and tacit backing from Edward III, he launched an invasion in 1332. The invasion began as an independent venture, but it quickly drew Edward into the fray. Balliol's forces won a decisive victory at the Battle of Duplin Moor, crowning him King of Scotland later that year. However, his hold on the throne was fragile, and David II's supporters soon forced him to flee back to England. This instability set the stage for Edward III's direct involvement. In 1333, Edward led a campaign to support Balliol and reassert English dominance in Scotland. The centerpiece of this effort was the siege of Berwick-upon-Tweed, a strategically vital border town. The Scots, determined to relieve the town, marched south under the command of Sir Archibald Douglas. On July 19, 1333, the two sides clashed at Halidon Hill, a battle that would cement Edward's reputation as a military commander. The English army, though outnumbered, held the high ground, a tactical advantage that Edward had carefully chosen. But the true game-changer was the English longbow. Edward's archers rained down volleys of deadly arrows on the advancing Scots, devastating their ranks before they could even reach the English lines. Those who survived the onslaught faced a well-prepared English infantry and cavalry. By the end of the day, thousands of Scots lay dead, including Douglas and several high-ranking nobles. The victory was overwhelming. Halidon Hill was not just a battlefield triumph, it was a turning point. The English army's mastery of the longbow signaled a shift in medieval warfare, and Edward's leadership was hailed as a key factor in the victory. In the aftermath, Berwick surrendered, and Edward Balliol was reinstated as King of Scotland. To secure his position, Balliol agreed to cede the southern counties of Scotland to Edward III, further expanding English influence. Yet, the peace was fleeting. Balliol's rule remained tenuous, and resistance to his reign persisted. Despite Edward's successes, Scotland proved difficult to hold. David II fled to France, seeking support from the French crown, while Scottish forces continued to challenge English authority. Edward would spend much of the next decade managing the fallout, launching further campaigns and fortifying the border. Even so, the campaign of 1333 marked a significant achievement. Edward had not only demonstrated his prowess as a military leader, but had also begun to restore England's reputation on the battlefield. The victory at Halidon Hill and the temporary control over Scotland laid the groundwork for his future campaigns, both in Scotland and beyond. It was a taste of the military brilliance that would define his reign. As Edward III secured his authority in England and achieved significant victories in Scotland, his ambitions soon turned across the Channel to France. The spark for what would become the 100 Years' War came in 1328, when Charles IV of France died without a male heir. The end of the direct Capetian line opened the door to a succession dispute, and Edward III found himself with a compelling claim to the French throne. Edward's claim came through his mother, Isabella, the sister of Charles IV, and daughter of Philip IV of France. As the grandson of Philip IV, Edward argued that his right to the throne was stronger than that of Philip of Valois, a cousin of Charles IV, who ultimately ascended as King Philip VI. However, the French nobility had no desire to see their kingdom ruled by a foreign monarch, particularly one who was also the King of England. Philip VI's claim was swiftly confirmed, and Edward reluctantly paid homage to him in 1329 for the Duchy of Aquitaine, a territory in France held by the English crown. Tensions simmered over the next several years, as disputes over land, trade, and alliances deepened the divide between England and France. By 1337, the situation had reached a breaking point. Philip VI formally confiscated the Duchy of Aquitaine, citing Edward's failure to fulfill his feudal obligations. This act was not just a legal maneuver, it was a direct challenge to Edward's authority. In response, Edward revived his claim to the French throne, transforming a territorial dispute into a dynastic conflict that would span more than a century. Edward's claim to the French crown was not merely a matter of pride, it was also a strategic move. By asserting his right to rule France, he sought to rally support among French nobles opposed to Philip VI, disrupt France's alliances with Scotland, and bolster England's influence on the continent. But claiming the throne and securing it were two very different challenges. To pursue his ambitions, Edward needed to mobilize resources, secure alliances, and demonstrate England's military might. In 1337, the first skirmishes of what would later be known as the 100 Years' War began. Edward's strategy initially focused on naval dominance, recognizing the importance of controlling the English Channel. The first major test of this strategy came in 1340, at the Battle of Sluys, a pivotal naval engagement off the coast of Flanders. The French fleet, bolstered by ships from their Castilian allies, had grown into a formidable force, threatening England's ability to supply its armies and defend its shores. Edward, determined to assert England's supremacy at sea, personally led his fleet into battle. On June 24, 1340, the English and French fleets clashed in a bloody and chaotic confrontation. The battle showcased Edward's tactical acumen and the lethal effectiveness of the English longbow, which had already proven decisive in land battles like Halidon Hill. The longbowmen, stationed on English ships, unleashed devastating volleys that shattered the French forces. By the end of the day, the French fleet was virtually annihilated. More than 18,000 French sailors and soldiers perished, and all but a handful of their ships were destroyed or captured. The victory at Sluys was a turning point. England secured control of the Channel, ensuring that its armies could move freely between the continent and home. It also dealt a severe blow to Philip VI's prestige, demonstrating that Edward III was not only a capable land commander, but also a force to be reckoned with at sea. However, while Sluys established England's naval dominance, the broader war was just beginning. Edward's claim to the French throne would be contested through a series of grueling campaigns, alliances, and shifting fortunes. The Battle of Sluys had shown the world that Edward III was willing to fight for his ambitions, and that he had the skill and resolve to make them a reality. But the road ahead would be long, marked by both triumph and hardship, as England and France plunged into decades of conflict. Edward III's military strategies set him apart as one of the most innovative and formidable commanders of his time. He not only understood the art of war, but revolutionized it, harnessing new tactics and weaponry that would change the face of medieval combat. Central to his success was the English longbow, a weapon that became synonymous with Edward's armies and proved devastating on the battlefield. The longbow, with its remarkable range and rapid rate of fire, gave English forces a decisive edge against their opponents. Edward recognized its potential early in his campaigns and ensured that his armies were well trained in its use. Unlike the crossbow, which was slow to reload, the longbow could unleash a storm of arrows in seconds, penetrating armor and breaking enemy formations before they could even engage. Edward's strategic deployment of longbowmen would prove critical in two of his most famous battles, Crécy and Neville's Cross. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 was a defining moment in the 100 Years' War, and a testament to Edward's brilliance as a commander. After landing in Normandy and cutting a swath through French territory, Edward's forces, numbering around 12,000, found themselves pursued by a much larger French army under King Philip VI. Despite being outnumbered, Edward chose his battlefield carefully, taking up a defensive position on a hill near the town of Crécy. As the French army, swollen to over 20,000 men, prepared to attack, Edward arranged his troops into 3 divisions, with longbowmen positioned on the flanks. The French, confident in their numerical superiority, launched wave after wave of assaults. But their approach was chaotic, and their reliance on heavily armored cavalry proved disastrous. As the French knights charged up the hill, they were met with relentless volleys of arrows from the English longbowmen. Horses and men fell in droves, their armor offering little protection against the piercing arrows. When the French finally reached the English lines, they were already broken and demoralized. Edward's disciplined infantry easily repelled the weakened attackers. By the time the battle ended, the French had suffered staggering losses. Thousands of knights and soldiers lay dead, including several high-ranking nobles. The English, by contrast, sustained only a few hundred casualties. Crécy was not just a victory. It was a masterclass in strategy, showcasing the effectiveness of the longbow and the importance of terrain in medieval warfare. While Crécy cemented Edward's reputation in France, the same year saw another remarkable victory on English soil. At Neville's Cross, near Durham, Edward's northern forces confronted a Scottish invasion led by David II. The Scots, taking advantage of Edward's absence in France, had launched a campaign to reclaim territory lost during earlier conflicts. However, they underestimated the preparedness of the English defenders. Under the command of Lord Ralph Neville, the English forces, though outnumbered, employed similar tactics to those used at Crécy. Longbowmen devastated the advancing Scottish troops, creating chaos and inflicting heavy casualties. By the end of the battle, the Scots were not only defeated, but humiliated. King David II himself was captured and taken prisoner, where he would remain in English custody for over a decade. The victory at Neville's Cross solidified England's hold over its northern border and weakened Scottish resistance for years to come. These battles were more than just military triumphs. They marked Edward's emergence as a leader who could inspire his troops, outmaneuver his enemies, and turn the tide of history. His ability to blend traditional knightly valor with innovative tactics made him a pioneer of medieval warfare. Time and again, Edward demonstrated that superior strategy and discipline could overcome even the largest and most powerful armies. Through victories like Crécy and Neville's Cross, Edward III elevated England to a new level of military prestige. He transformed the kingdom into a dominant force, capable of challenging even the mightiest powers of Europe. Yet, these battles were just the beginning of his journey as a warrior king. Edward's ambitions stretched far beyond the battlefield, shaping the destiny of England for generations to come. While Edward III is best remembered for his military triumphs, his domestic achievements and reforms were equally significant, leaving a legacy that shaped England for centuries. Behind the battlefield, Victories was a ruler with a keen understanding of governance, a vision for national identity, and a dedication to strengthening the fabric of his kingdom. One of Edward's most enduring contributions was the establishment of the Order of the Garter in 1348. This exclusive chivalric order was inspired by Edward's fascination with King Arthur and the ideals of knightly valor. The order was dedicated to St. George, England's patron saint, and it symbolized the unity and honor of the English elite, limited to just 25 knights, plus the king himself. Its members included Edward's most trusted allies, military leaders, and noblemen. The emblem of the order, a garter inscribed with the motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it, became a symbol of loyalty, chivalry, and excellence. Legend has it that Edward uttered the phrase at court after a lady dropped her garter, and his rebuke of those who laughed at her became the order's defining ethos. Whether or not the story is true, the Order of the Garter remains the highest chivalric honor in England to this day, a testament to Edward's ability to merge tradition and innovation. Beyond the pomp and ceremony of chivalric orders, Edward focused on practical governance. His reign saw the strengthening of the justice of the peace, a role that would become central to English local government. These officials were responsible for maintaining law and order in their communities, a task that became increasingly important in the wake of the Black Death, which caused widespread social and economic upheaval. The justices of the peace were tasked with enforcing laws, including the Statute of Laborers of 1351, which Edward introduced to stabilize wages and labor practices after the plague had decimated the population. This statute aimed to prevent labor shortages from driving wages too high, preserving economic stability in a time of crisis. While the statute faced resistance from workers and was difficult to enforce, it demonstrated Edward's commitment to maintaining order and mitigating the chaos caused by the pandemic. The role of the justices of the peace expanded during Edward's reign, laying the groundwork for a system of local governance that would endure for centuries. These officials became critical in administering justice at the local level, bridging the gap between the crown and its subjects. Over time, their authority extended beyond labor disputes to include criminal cases and other administrative duties, making them a cornerstone of English law and governance. Edward's domestic reforms also extended to financial and administrative systems. Recognizing the importance of a stable currency, he oversaw a significant recoinage in the early 1350s, introducing new coins such as the gold noble and the silver groat. This reform not only strengthened the economy but also reinforced England's position as a key player in European trade. Through these domestic achievements, Edward demonstrated that his vision for England extended far beyond the battlefield. He understood the importance of fostering unity, promoting justice, and ensuring economic stability. The establishment of the Order of the Garter gave England a symbol of national pride, while his administrative reforms ensured that the kingdom was equipped to weather the challenges of his time. Edward's legacy was not just one of conquest, but of building a stronger, more cohesive England, one that could stand the test of time. The arrival of the Black Death in 1348 was one of the most devastating events in European history, and Edward III's England was no exception. The bubonic plague swept across the kingdom with horrifying speed, killing as much as a third of the population within just a few years. Entire villages were wiped out, fields lay fallow, and the social and economic order was thrown into chaos. Yet, even amid this unprecedented catastrophe, Edward demonstrated remarkable leadership, steering England through one of its darkest chapters. Plague struck England in the late summer of 1348, and by autumn, cases were being reported in London. As the death toll rose, fear and uncertainty gripped the population. Like many monarchs of the time, Edward removed himself and his court from the most densely populated areas, effectively quarantining in rural retreats. This decision not only protected the royal family, but ensured that Edward could continue to govern, while much of the country was paralyzed by the outbreak. The Black Death's impact went far beyond the immediate loss of life. It created a severe labor shortage, as the vast number of deaths left fields untended and workshops empty. Survivors, aware of how scarce their labor had become, began demanding higher wages. Landowners and employers, desperate to keep their estates running, often complied. For workers, this was a moment of opportunity, but for the kingdom's economic structure, it threatened instability. Edward acted swiftly to address these challenges. In 1351, he introduced the Statute of Laborers, a groundbreaking piece of legislation aimed at stabilizing the economy. The statute sought to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and required all able-bodied men to work for the same wages they had earned before the crisis. It also imposed penalties on employers who offered higher wages and workers who refused to accept lawful employment. The Statute of Laborers was far from universally popular. Workers, having seen their bargaining power increase, were understandably resistant to the restrictions. Enforcement proved difficult, as local officials often faced resistance from both landowners and laborers. Yet, the statute served as a crucial attempt to bring order to a chaotic labor market and prevent the economic collapse of Edward's kingdom. To enforce the statute and maintain stability, Edward relied heavily on the justices of the peace, a role he had already expanded earlier in his reign. These officials were tasked with investigating violations of the statute and ensuring compliance in their local communities. Their efforts, though uneven, helped maintain a degree of control during a time when the social fabric of England was under immense strain. The Black Death also left its mark on England's legal and administrative systems. Courts were temporarily shut down, and a parliament planned for 1349 was abandoned. In many cases, Edward's government had to adapt on the fly, implementing measures that would later become part of a broader framework for dealing with crises. Edward's leadership during the Black Death was not without challenges, but his actions demonstrated an ability to confront the realities of a changing world. By focusing on economic stability and the enforcement of labor laws, he ensured that England could recover and rebuild. The Statute of Laborers, while controversial, became a cornerstone of his efforts to navigate the aftermath of the plague. Ultimately, Edward's handling of the Black Death highlighted his resilience as a ruler. He faced a disaster of unimaginable scale and responded with practical measures that helped preserve the kingdom's economy and order. The scars of the plague would linger for generations, but Edward's leadership ensured that England emerged from the crisis with its institutions and social structures intact. Edward III's family was a vital part of his reign, both politically and militarily. He and Queen Philippa of Hainault had at least 12 children, 9 of whom survived into adulthood, a remarkable number for the time. Among them, none loomed larger than Edward's eldest son and heir, Edward of Woodstock, better known to history as the Black Prince. Charismatic, skilled in battle, and deeply loyal to his father, the Black Prince was a driving force in the successes of Edward III's later campaigns. Born in 1330, Edward the Black Prince grew up in a world of chivalry, martial ambition, and high expectations. His father took great care to ensure that his eldest son was trained in the arts of war and governance from an early age. By the time he was a teenager, the young prince was already accompanying his father on military campaigns, gaining first-hand experience in leadership and strategy. These early years shaped him into one of the most accomplished military commanders of the medieval period. The Black Prince's first taste of glory came at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, where he fought alongside his father. Just 16 at the time, he commanded a division of the English army and held his ground against waves of French assaults. His courage under fire earned him widespread acclaim, and he quickly became a symbol of England's military prowess. Yet, this was only the beginning of his career as a leader. The prince's most famous victory came a decade later, at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. By then, he had taken charge of campaigns in southwestern France, commanding an army of roughly 6,000 men. The campaign, characterized by a series of destructive raids known as chevauchées, brought him deep into enemy territory, where he was eventually confronted by a much larger French force under King Jean II. Outnumbered and seemingly cornered, the Black Prince demonstrated extraordinary tactical brilliance. He positioned his troops on high ground, using natural defenses to offset the enemy's numerical advantage. As at Crécy, the English longbowmen played a decisive role, unleashing devastating volleys that broke the French lines. The battle ended in chaos for the French, with thousands of their troops killed or captured. Most notably, King Jean II himself was taken prisoner, a triumph that left France politically destabilized and placed Edward III in a commanding position in the ongoing conflict. The victory at Poitiers solidified the Black Prince's reputation as one of the greatest military leaders of his time. He returned to England a hero, celebrated not just for his success, but for the chivalric ideals he embodied. His triumphs also reinforced Edward III's broader vision of England as a dominant power in Europe, with his family playing a central role in achieving that goal. Beyond the battlefield, the Black Prince was a devoted son and a key figure in his father's court. His loyalty to Edward III never wavered, and he worked tirelessly to support the king's military and political ambitions. Yet the pressures of war and leadership took a toll on him. By the late 1360s, his health began to decline, and he was increasingly unable to lead in the field. Edward III's other children also played significant roles in the kingdom's affairs. His second son, Lionel of Antwerp, was appointed to govern Ireland and worked to secure English control there. John of Gaunt, his third surviving son, became a key figure in English politics and military campaigns, particularly during the later years of Edward's reign. The royal family, with its numerous alliances and spheres of influence, was a cornerstone of Edward's strategy for maintaining and expanding his power. Yet, it was the Black Prince who stood out as the embodiment of Edward III's legacy. His victories at Crécy and Poitiers not only secured England's dominance on the battlefield, but also inspired a sense of national pride and unity. Through his eldest son, Edward III's vision of a powerful and chivalrous England came to life, ensuring that the king's ambitions endured, even as his own health and strength began to wane. As Edward III's reign progressed, his ambitions in France reached a critical point. The mid-1350s brought some of England's most significant victories, but sustaining the war was becoming increasingly costly. The time was ripe for negotiations, and the resulting Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 marked one of the high points of Edward's reign. This agreement not only underscored England's dominance, but also brought a temporary halt to the ravages of the 100 Years' War. The Treaty of Bretigny was born out of years of relentless conflict that had left both England and France exhausted. Edward's victory at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where his son, the Black Prince, captured King Jean II of France, gave England the upper hand in negotiations. The French king's imprisonment in England placed immense pressure on France to make concessions, and after years of talks, the treaty was finalized. Under its terms, Edward III renounced his claim to the French throne in exchange for substantial territorial gains. The Duchy of Aquitaine, already held by England, was significantly expanded, granting Edward control over vast stretches of western France. He also retained the strategically vital port of Calais and the neighboring region of Ponthieu, further solidifying England's foothold on the continent. These territories were granted to Edward in full sovereignty, meaning he no longer owed homage to the French crown for them, a major victory that freed England from a feudal relationship with France. The Treaty of Bretigny also required France to pay an enormous ransom of $500,000 for the release of King Jean II. This staggering sum was equivalent to several years of England's revenue, providing a financial windfall that Edward used to stabilize his war-battered kingdom and fund further military campaigns. In Scotland, Edward's efforts to consolidate power were similarly fruitful. The earlier victory at Neville's Cross in 1346 had left David II, the Scottish king, in English captivity for over a decade. By 1357, Edward negotiated the Treaty of Berwick, securing David's release in exchange for a hefty ransom of 100,000 marks. This agreement effectively ended the Second Scottish War of Independence, solidifying Edward's position as a dominant force in the British Isles. The territorial gains secured through these treaties marked the peak of Edward's reign. England now held more land in France than it had since the days of the Angevin Empire, and its influence in Scotland was stronger than at any point in recent memory. These achievements reinforced Edward's vision of England as a preeminent power, capable of challenging its neighbors on every front. However, the peace brought by the Treaty of Bretigny was short-lived. While it gave England nearly a decade of breathing room, the underlying tensions between the two kingdoms remained unresolved. The renunciation of Edward's claim to the French throne, a key condition of the treaty, was never fully carried out, and disputes over sovereignty in Aquitaine reignited hostilities by the end of the decade. Even so, the Treaty of Bretigny represented a masterstroke of diplomacy. It showcased Edward's ability to leverage his military successes into political and territorial gains, demonstrating that his ambitions extended far beyond the battlefield. For a brief moment, Edward III stood at the height of his power, his kingdom enriched, his lands expanded, and his influence unrivaled. Edward III's reign was not only marked by military triumphs and territorial expansion, but also by a profound cultural and linguistic shift that would shape England for generations. One of his most enduring legacies was the formal adoption of English as the language of government, a milestone that signaled the evolution of Middle English into a language of power and identity. For centuries, the Norman conquest had left its mark on England's linguistic landscape. French was the language of the court, the nobility, and the legal system, while Latin dominated religious and academic discourse. English, the language of the common people, was relegated to everyday use, with little influence over the workings of government or the recording of history. This linguistic hierarchy began to shift during Edward's reign, reflecting both a growing sense of national identity and the practical realities of governing a diverse population. In 1362, Edward introduced the Statute of Pleading, which declared that English, rather than French, should be used in the law courts. This was a monumental step in making English the language of governance, bringing the legal system closer to the people it served. For the first time, official proceedings were conducted in a language that the majority of the population could understand, bridging the gap between rulers and subjects. The same year, Parliament opened for the first time in English, marking another symbolic break from the dominance of French. These changes were not just administrative conveniences, they were a reflection of a broader cultural transformation. The use of English in official contexts began to elevate its status, fostering its development as a language capable of handling complex legal, political, and intellectual concepts. Edward's reign also coincided with the flourishing of Middle English literature, which began to emerge as a vibrant expression of the kingdom's cultural identity. While Edward himself was not a patron of literature, in the way later monarchs like Elizabethan would be, the stability and sense of unity he brought to England provided fertile ground for writers like Geoffrey Chaucer to rise to prominence. Chaucer, often regarded as the father of English literature, wrote in Middle English, helping to solidify its legitimacy as a literary language. The shift toward English as a language of government and culture also had practical roots. The Black Death, which had devastated the population, caused labor shortages that brought the lower and middle classes into closer interaction with the elite. As these groups gained more influence, the need for a common language that transcended social boundaries became apparent. English, already spoken by the vast majority, was the natural choice. By embracing English as a language of governance, Edward III helped to lay the foundations for its evolution into a unifying force in England, and, later, a global language. The transition from French and Latin to English during his reign was not immediate or absolute, but it set in motion a process that would define the kingdom's identity for centuries. Edward's linguistic reforms were not just practical, they were symbolic. They reflected a king who understood the power of language in creating a sense of unity and shared purpose. By making English the language of law and government, Edward forged a stronger connection between the crown and the people, ensuring that his legacy would endure not only in battlefields and treaties, but in the very words that shaped the nation's future. The late years of Edward III's reign were marked by growing challenges that tested the resilience of his earlier successes. After decades of triumph, both abroad and at home, England faced the strain of renewed conflict, shifting fortunes, and internal unrest. The long shadow of the 100 Years' War returned, and the aging king found himself grappling with the difficulties of maintaining the vast gains achieved during his prime. In 1369, the fragile peace established by the Treaty of Bretigny broke down. France, under the leadership of Charles V, reignited the conflict with England. Charles, a shrewd and strategic ruler, exploited unrest within the English-controlled territories in Aquitaine. He declared the duchy forfeited, challenging Edward's sovereignty and forcing the English to defend their holdings. The resumption of the 100 Years' War came at a time when England's resources were already stretched, and the aging king's ability to lead had waned. The French strategy under Charles V was markedly different from that of his predecessors. Instead of engaging the English in pitched battles where they had repeatedly suffered devastating defeats, the French adopted a more cautious approach, focusing on attrition and fortification. Castles were strengthened, supply lines were disrupted, and local uprisings were encouraged. This war of endurance gradually chipped away at England's territorial gains. In 1370, Edward's son, the Black Prince, launched a campaign to defend Aquitaine, but his health was failing. Though a brilliant commander in his youth, the prince could no longer lead with the vigor that had defined his earlier campaigns. The war dragged on, with neither side able to secure a decisive advantage. By 1373, a major chevauchée led by Edward's third son, John of Gaunt, resulted in widespread destruction, but achieved little in terms of strategic gains. At sea, England's fortunes also faltered. In 1372, the French, with support from Castilian allies, defeated the English navy off the coast of La Rochelle. This loss disrupted England's ability to resupply its forces in France, further weakening their hold on the continent. By the mid-1370s, the English presence in France had been reduced to a few key territories, including Calais and Bordeaux. The dream of controlling vast swathes of French land, so central to Edward's ambitions, was slipping away. Domestically, the strain of prolonged war began to take its toll. England's economy, already battered by the effects of the Black Death, struggled to bear the cost of endless campaigns. The financial demands of war led to repeated calls for taxation, which provoked discontent among the nobility and commoners alike. Parliament became increasingly vocal in its grievances, reflecting the growing frustrations of a kingdom weary of war. The Good Parliament of 1376 was a turning point in Edward's late reign. Called to approve additional funds for the war, it became a platform for addressing widespread dissatisfaction with the king's advisors and the state of governance. Corruption and mismanagement within the royal court were key concerns, and several of Edward's closest allies were forced from power. The Parliament also reflected the shifting dynamics of power in England, as the nobility and emerging middle class asserted greater influence over the monarchy. Compounding these challenges was Edward's own decline. By the 1370s, the once vigorous king was in failing health, possibly suffering from a series of strokes. His ability to govern diminished, and much of the day-to-day running of the kingdom fell to his sons and advisors. The death of the Black Prince in 1376 was a devastating blow, both personally and politically. Edward had lost his heir, and the kingdom had lost one of its most capable leaders. By the time of Edward's death in 1377, England was a kingdom at a crossroads. The glory days of Crécy and Poitiers were long past, and the struggles of the late reign had exposed the vulnerabilities of Edward's ambitious vision. Yet, even in decline, Edward III left an indelible mark on England. His earlier successes had elevated the kingdom to new heights, and the challenges of his later years, while humbling, could not erase the achievements that had defined his reign. The final years of Edward III's reign were marked by the slow and inevitable decline of a once vibrant king. Known in his prime for his energy, charisma, and military brilliance, Edward's later years revealed a stark contrast. Age and illness took their toll, reducing his role in governance, and leaving a vacuum that his sons and advisors struggled to fill. The waning strength of the monarch mirrored the fading momentum of his kingdom, as England faced internal unrest and external challenges. Edward's health began to falter noticeably by the late 1360s. By this time, he was over 55, a respectable age in the medieval world, but one that brought its burdens. Contemporary accounts suggest that Edward suffered a series of strokes, leaving him physically weakened and, at times, mentally impaired. The sharpness that had defined his decision-making in earlier years gave way to indecision and lethargy. By the 1370s, he was no longer the driving force behind England's government or military campaigns. With Edward's diminished capacity, power shifted increasingly to his sons and advisors. Edward's eldest son, the Black Prince, was the natural leader in his father's absence, but his health, too, was failing. Years of campaigning had worn him down, and by the mid-1370s, he was gravely ill. The prince's decline created a leadership void, one that was filled, to varying degrees of success, by Edward's third son, John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was an ambitious and capable figure, but he lacked the popularity and battlefield success of his elder brother. His growing influence over the kingdom was met with suspicion by many in court and among the wider nobility. Tensions flared as John attempted to consolidate power, leading to political unrest during his father's later reign. The Good Parliament of 1376 became a flashpoint for these tensions. Called to approve additional funds for the war effort, it quickly turned into a platform for addressing grievances against the royal administration. Accusations of corruption and favoritism were leveled against Edward's advisors, particularly figures close to John of Gaunt. The Parliament demanded reforms and the removal of unpopular officials, reflecting the growing frustration with how the kingdom was being governed in Edward's absence. The strain of these political struggles was compounded by personal loss. In 1376, Edward suffered the devastating blow of the Black Prince's death. His heir and once vital partner in governance succumbed to illness, leaving Edward bereft of both a son and a trusted ally. The loss plunged the aging king into further decline, and his court was left scrambling to manage the succession. The Black Prince's 10-year-old son, Richard, was now next in line for the throne, raising concerns about a potential regency and the stability of the kingdom. As Edward's health continued to deteriorate, his once legendary presence faded into the background. Confined to his residences, he was increasingly disconnected from the realities of governance. Advisors and factions within the court jockeyed for influence, while England struggled with the financial and political strain of prolonged conflict in France and discontent at home. Edward's final months were marked by physical suffering. In early 1377, a severe abscess compounded his already fragile condition. The once great warrior king, who had led armies to glory at Crécy and Poitiers, was now bedridden, dependent on those around him for care. On June 21, 1377, Edward III passed away at Sheen Palace, surrounded by the remnants of his once mighty court. His death marked the end of an era. Edward's reign, which had spanned 50 years, was one of the longest in English history. Though his final years were overshadowed by decline and difficulty, they could not diminish the remarkable achievements of his earlier reign. Edward's passing left England at a crossroads, with his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, inheriting a kingdom both enriched and burdened by the legacy of his grandfather's ambition. The Good Parliament of 1376 was a pivotal moment in Edward III's reign, reflecting the growing discontent within England as the kingdom grappled with the realities of prolonged war, financial strain, and a monarch no longer able to command as he once had. What began as a routine parliamentary session to approve funds for the ongoing campaigns in France quickly evolved into a confrontation between the crown and a restless political nation, deeply dissatisfied with the state of governance. By the mid-1370s, England was weary. The glories of Edward's earlier years, marked by triumphs at Crécy and Poitiers, had given way to costly setbacks and an increasingly fragile hold over France. The kingdom's coffers were drained, and new taxes were needed to sustain the war effort. Parliament, representing the interests of the nobility, gentry, and emerging middle class, had grown bolder in asserting its voice, and the session convened in 1376 became an outlet for years of pent-up frustration. The grievances aired during the Good Parliament were wide-ranging but focused heavily on corruption and mismanagement within Edward's court. Chief among the targets of criticism was William Latimer, a trusted advisor to the king, and Alice Perrers, Edward's longtime companion and confidant. Accusations of favoritism, embezzlement, and self-enrichment were leveled at these figures, symbolizing broader dissatisfaction with how power was being wielded in the king's name. John of Gaunt, Edward's third surviving son, also became a focus of the Parliament's ire. As one of the most influential figures in the kingdom, Gaunt had assumed a leading role in governance, particularly as his father's health deteriorated. However, his growing authority and perceived self-interest alienated many nobles and MPs, who viewed him as overreaching. Tensions flared as Gaunt sought to protect his allies, setting the stage for a power struggle that would define the final years of Edward's reign. The Good Parliament demanded significant reforms. Chief among these were the dismissal of Latimer and Perrers, as well as measures to curb the influence of court favorites and address the kingdom's financial mismanagement. The Parliament also pushed for greater accountability, insisting on their right to oversee royal finances and hold officials to account for corruption. These demands marked a significant assertion of parliamentary power, challenging the unchecked authority of the crown. Compounding the political turbulence was the personal tragedy of the Black Prince's death. On June 8, 1376, Edward's eldest son and heir succumbed to a long illness, likely dysentery, at the age of 45. His death was a devastating blow, both to Edward personally and to the stability of the realm. The Black Prince had been the linchpin of England's military and political strategy, a beloved figure whose leadership inspired loyalty and confidence. His passing left a void that no one could easily fill. With the Black Prince gone, the line of succession shifted to his 10-year-old son, Richard of Bordeaux. The prospect of a child king raised concerns about the future of the monarchy, particularly in light of the political unrest already gripping the kingdom. Fears of a regency, dominated by figures like John of Gaunt, heightened the stakes of the parliamentary reforms, as many sought to curtail Gaunt's influence and ensure that Richard's eventual reign would not be overshadowed by factionalism. The Good Parliament ultimately succeeded in forcing some of its demands. Latimer and other unpopular figures were removed from their positions, and Alice Perrers was banned from appearing in court. However, the reforms were short-lived. After the Parliament dissolved, John of Gaunt moved swiftly to reassert control, undoing many of the changes and reinstating his allies. Perrers returned to court, and the political tensions that had erupted during the session simmered beneath the surface. Despite its limited immediate impact, the Good Parliament was a watershed moment in the evolution of English governance. It demonstrated the growing assertiveness of Parliament as a counterbalance to royal authority, setting a precedent for future challenges to the crown. At the same time, it underscored the fragility of Edward III's later reign, as the king's declining health and the death of the Black Prince left England vulnerable to factional strife and uncertainty. The events of 1376 revealed a kingdom at a crossroads. Edward III, once the embodiment of chivalric kingship and martial glory, was now a shadow of his former self. The Black Prince's death had removed the kingdom's strongest leader, leaving a power vacuum that would define the final months of Edward's life and set the stage for the turbulent reign of his grandson, Richard II. Edward III, a monarch whose reign had spanned half a century, breathed his last on June 21, 1377, at Sheen Palace. His death marked the end of an era defined by extraordinary military triumphs, cultural transformation, and political evolution. Once a vibrant and commanding figure, Edward had become frail in his final years. his health undermined by age and illness. Despite this, his passing left a profound sense of loss in a kingdom that had flourished under his leadership, even as it faced growing challenges. Chronicler Jean Froissart captured the somber majesty of Edward's funeral in vivid detail, immortalizing the event in his chronicles. He described the king's embalmed body being placed on a bier and borne by 24 knights dressed in black. Behind them walked Edward's surviving sons, alongside the Duke of Brittany and the Earl of March. The cortege moved through the streets of London at a slow and deliberate pace, the king's face uncovered for all to see. Froissart painted a haunting picture of the grief that swept through the capital. Crowds lined the streets, their cries and laments echoing through the city. The people, many of whom had known no other ruler, mourned the loss of a king who had brought England to unprecedented heights of power and prestige. Froissart wrote, "To witness and hear the grief of the people, their sobs and screams and lamentations on that day would have rendered anyone's heart." It was a fitting tribute to a monarch who had come to symbolize England's strength and ambition. Edward was buried in Westminster Abbey, alongside many of England's most illustrious kings and queens. His tomb became a place of reverence, a reminder of the golden age he had presided over. Yet, even as the funeral rites were completed, the question of what lay ahead for England loomed large. The succession passed to Edward's grandson, Richard II, the 10-year-old son of the Black Prince. While Richard's claim to the throne was undisputed, his youth left the kingdom vulnerable to the kind of factionalism and regency struggles that Edward's own early years had witnessed. John of Gaunt, Edward's third surviving son, emerged as a dominant figure in the new government, but his influence was met with suspicion and resistance from other nobles and parliamentarians. Despite the uncertainty that followed, Edward's legacy endured. His reign had seen England transformed into a formidable military power, with victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Neville's Cross, elevating its status on the European stage. The territorial gains Edward secured, particularly Calais, would remain pivotal to England's continental ambitions for centuries. Edward's domestic achievements were equally lasting. The adoption of English as the language of governance laid the groundwork for its eventual rise as a global lingua franca. His reforms in local government, particularly the strengthening of the justice of the peace, created institutions that would endure for generations. Even his establishment of the Order of the Garter, a symbol of chivalric ideals, continues to this day as England's highest order of knighthood. However, Edward's influence extended beyond his accomplishments. He inspired a sense of national identity, uniting England in a shared vision of glory and ambition. Through his leadership, he fostered a belief that the kingdom could rival and surpass its continental neighbors, a belief that would shape England's trajectory for centuries to come. Though his later years were marked by decline and setbacks, Edward III remains one of England's most remarkable monarchs. His reign bridged the medieval and modern worlds, leaving a legacy of innovation, resilience, and pride. As England moved forward under the rule of his grandson, it carried with it the imprint of a king who had reshaped the nation's destiny. Edward's story, with its triumphs and trials, would echo through history, a testament to the enduring power of vision and determination. Edward III's reign is a tale of unparalleled ambition, extraordinary military achievements, and a lasting legacy of governance that shaped the foundation of the English monarchy. His 50-year rule stands as one of the longest and most influential in England's history, earning him a place among the great monarchs of the medieval era. Yet, as with any ruler of such stature, his reign invites comparison and debate, particularly alongside figures like Edward I and Henry V, whose own legacies have left deep marks on England's story. On the battlefield, Edward III was a master tactician and a visionary leader, unmatched in his ability to transform England's military fortunes. His victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Neville's Cross not only established the longbow as a defining weapon of English dominance, but also demonstrated his ability to outmaneuver and outthink his opponents. The triumphs of Edward's armies carved a path for England to assert itself as a formidable power, rivaling even the mightiest kingdoms of Europe. In this respect, he was a worthy successor to his grandfather, Edward the Southern, known as the Hammer of the Scots, and a precursor to his great-grandson Henry V, the victor of Agincourt. Yet Edward III's brilliance was not confined to the battlefield. His military successes were complemented by a vision for governance that left a lasting imprint on England's political and administrative landscape. He strengthened the role of Parliament, using it not merely as a tool for raising taxes, but as a forum for addressing the grievances of the political nation. This engagement with Parliament set the stage for the gradual evolution of England's constitutional monarchy, making Edward's reign a bridge between the authoritarian rule of earlier kings and the more collaborative governance of later centuries. Edward's reforms in local administration also deserve recognition. The Justice of the Peace, whose role he expanded and empowered, became a cornerstone of English governance, ensuring law and order across the kingdom. His establishment of the Statute of Labourers in the aftermath of the Black Death demonstrated his ability to adapt to unprecedented crises, stabilizing the labor market during a time of upheaval. These achievements reveal a king who understood the intricate balance between power and policy, a ruler who could wield authority without alienating those he governed. In the cultural sphere, Edward's reign saw the flowering of Middle English as a language of governance and literature. His decision to conduct legal proceedings in English and to open Parliament in the vernacular reflected a growing sense of national identity, breaking away from the Norman legacy of French dominance. This linguistic shift paved the way for writers like Geoffrey Chaucer to elevate English into a literary force, with Edward himself setting the tone for a nation that would later give rise to a global language. However, Edward's reign was not without its flaws. His later years, marked by declining health and the loss of his heir, the Black Prince, saw the kingdom falter. The resurgence of conflict in France under Charles III and the internal unrest symbolized by the Good Parliament of 1376 highlighted the fragility of Edward's accomplishments in the face of prolonged war and political factionalism. The territorial gains achieved through the Treaty of Bretigny began to unravel, and the strain of financing decades of conflict left England burdened with debt and discontent. When compared to Edward I, who laid the foundation for a centralized English state, and Henry V, whose charisma and military genius achieved the zenith of English fortunes in France, Edward III occupies a middle ground. He combined the administrative foresight of his grandfather with the martial ambition of his descendants, creating a legacy that was both visionary and practical. Edward III's reign was, at its core, about transformation. He turned England from a relatively insular kingdom into a major player on the European stage. His victories inspired national pride, his reforms strengthened the kingdom's foundations, and his cultural contributions redefined its identity. While his final years were shadowed by decline, they could not erase the brilliance of his earlier achievements. In assessing Edward III's legacy, it is clear that he was one of England's most consequential monarchs. His reign set the stage for centuries of English dominance, both militarily and culturally. Though his accomplishments are sometimes overshadowed by the legends of Edward I and Henry V, his vision and leadership remain integral to the story of England. Edward III was a king who dreamed boldly, acted decisively, and left a kingdom forever changed by his hand. Edward III's legacy is one of enduring significance, not just for England, but for the wider medieval world. His reign was a tapestry of military brilliance, institutional reform, and cultural transformation, woven together over the course of 5 decades. Under his leadership, England evolved from a relatively modest kingdom into a formidable European power, asserting its influence on both the battlefield and the political stage. The 100 Years' War, which Edward instigated, reshaped the medieval world. It fostered the development of national identities, not just in England, but in France as well. As the long conflict demanded greater administrative sophistication and rallied populations around shared causes, Edward's victories at Crécy and Poitiers showcased England's military innovation, establishing the longbow as the era's most fearsome weapon and inspiring future generations of commanders. Even the eventual setbacks in France could not diminish the reputation Edward earned as one of the medieval period's greatest generals. Domestically, Edward's reign laid the groundwork for many aspects of modern governance. His reliance on Parliament to raise funds for his campaigns elevated its importance, setting precedents for parliamentary authority that would shape the constitutional evolution of England. The strengthening of local governance through the role of the Justice of the Peace, coupled with his response to the Black Death through the Statute of Laborers, demonstrated his ability to adapt to crises with long-lasting solutions. Culturally, Edward's impact was transformative. The elevation of English as the language of government and law was a defining moment in the kingdom's identity, breaking centuries of Norman French dominance. This linguistic shift, coupled with the flowering of Middle English literature, helped pave the way for England's cultural legacy to flourish in the centuries to come. And yet, despite these achievements, Edward III remains somewhat overlooked in the pantheon of England's great kings. His grandson, Richard II, and the tumultuous reigns that followed may have cast a shadow over Edward's accomplishments. Similarly, his own later years, marked by declining health and political unrest, have often been used to frame his reign as a tale of two halves. But when viewed as a whole, Edward's legacy is undeniable. Few monarchs have matched his combination of vision, military acumen, and ability to transform a kingdom's identity. Was Edward III England's greatest king? The answer depends on the lens through which his reign is viewed. Militarily, he was undoubtedly among the finest, standing alongside Edward I and Henry V as an unrivaled strategist. Administratively, his foresight in strengthening Parliament and local governance set the stage for the evolution of English political life. Culturally, his embrace of English as a unifying force helped define a nation. In many ways, he was a king ahead of his time, whose contributions resonate even today. Edward III's reign, though not without its flaws, left England stronger, prouder, and more united. His vision helped shape a kingdom that could weather the storms of the late medieval period and emerge as a rising power in the centuries to follow. Perhaps he does not enjoy the same renown as some of his successors or predecessors, but his legacy remains woven into the very fabric of English history, a king who dreamed boldly and left an indelible mark.